The empath does not awaken by loving more. The empath awakens the moment caring collapses. This statement sounds cold, almost brutal, yet it exposes a truth most spiritual teachings avoid. For years, the empath believes their sensitivity is their highest virtue. Compassion becomes identity. Emotional availability becomes self-worth. Giving becomes proof of goodness. But beneath this self-image, something fractures silently. The internal tension begins when constant emotional labor no longer leads to connection, peace, or meaning. Anxiety replaces intuition. Exhaustion replaces purpose. The empath feels drained, unseen, strangely disconnected from life itself, while still appearing kind and present on the surface. This fracture was precisely described by Carl Jung, who warned that unchecked identification with the helper archetype leads to psychic imbalance. Jung saw this moment as a hidden threshold in individuation, where the soul must either mature or collapse into resentment and self-betrayal. By the end of this video, your understanding of empathy, detachment, and spiritual awakening will be permanently altered. You will see why the moment the empath stops caring is not failure, but the most dangerous and powerful phase of consciousness evolution. The empath is not born fragile, and they are not born enlightened. They are shaped slowly, quietly, through adaptation. What later appears as spiritual sensitivity often begins as a refined survival response. In early life, the empath learns that awareness of emotional undercurrents creates safety. They sense shifts in tone before words are spoken. They detect tension before it erupts. They learn to read faces, moods, silences, and atmospheres with extraordinary precision. This ability does not arise from luxury. It emerges from necessity. Over time, this sensitivity becomes automatic. The empath does not decide to tune in, it happens instinctively. Emotional environments are scanned constantly, not out of curiosity, but out of conditioning. Harmony becomes a priority, not because it is desired, but because chaos once felt dangerous. Gradually, attunement turns into responsibility. The empath begins to feel accountable for emotional balance in rooms they did not create, relationships they cannot control, and wounds they did not cause. Spiritual language later enters and reinforces this pattern. Compassion is praised, selflessness is celebrated, forgiveness is framed as moral superiority. The empath absorbs these teachings deeply, often without discernment. The message becomes internalized. To be good is to be available, to be evolved is to endure, to be loving is to absorb discomfort without resistance. Suffering is rebranded as meaning. What goes unnoticed is the slow erosion of the self. Emotional awareness expands outward, but inner authority remains underdeveloped. The empath becomes fluent in the inner worlds of others while losing contact with their own instincts, limits, and desires. Saying no feels unnatural. Choosing oneself feels selfish. Withdrawal feels like failure. Carl Jung warned precisely about this imbalance. He understood that identification with any single psychic function, especially feeling, leads to possession rather than integration. When empathy dominates without grounding in the shadow, the personality becomes lopsided. Sensitivity, instead of serving consciousness, begins to rule it. At this stage, the empath no longer knows where they end and others begin. Emotional boundaries blur. Moods are mistaken for intuition. Absorbed pain is confused with insight. The empath feels deeply, but clarity diminishes. Fatigue becomes a constant companion. Resentment simmers beneath kindness, often denied even to oneself. Yet outwardly, the empath appears admirable. They are described as understanding, patient, emotionally intelligent, spiritually mature. This external validation strengthens the identity. The role becomes fixed. To abandon it feels like erasing oneself. Jung would say the persona has fused with the soul. The empath is no longer wearing the mask, they are the mask. This is the long descent into the empath identity. It feels noble, it feels purposeful, it feels aligned with goodness. But beneath it lies a quiet fragmentation. The psyche is carrying weight it was never meant to bear. The soul is overextended, stretched thin across too many emotional territories. Eventually, the inner world grows crowded. There is little silence. Thoughts multiply. Anxiety seeps in without clear cause. A sense of disconnection emerges not from others, but from life itself. Joy becomes muted. Presence becomes effortful. The empath continues giving, listening, holding space, yet something essential no longer flows back. This is not because the empath lacks love. It is because love has been confused with self-erasure, and this confusion cannot last forever. The psyche, according to Jung, always moves toward balance. When one function dominates, the unconscious compensates. The shadow begins to stir, fatigue deepens, emotional numbness approaches. The very sensitivity that once felt sacred starts to feel heavy, intrusive, even invasive. This is not a collapse yet, it is a warning. The empath identity has reached its limit. There is a moment that does not arrive dramatically. No explosion, no clear decision, no visible breakdown. It arrives quietly, almost invisibly, and that is why it is so often misunderstood. Sensitivity, which once felt like a gift, begins to feel intrusive. Emotional awareness no longer feels illuminating, it feels invasive. The empath notices that their inner world no longer responds with warmth, but with strain. Something essential has shifted. The first sign is not cruelty. It is irritation without a clear target. The empath begins to feel restless in conversations that once felt meaningful. Listening starts to feel heavy. Emotional disclosures from others trigger fatigue instead of compassion. The empath still shows up, still nods, still offers understanding, but internally there is resistance. Not anger yet, not detachment yet. Just a subtle tightening of the psyche, as if something inside is pulling away. This is the point where sensitivity turns inward and begins to wound the soul. The empath starts to notice that their emotional responses feel delayed or artificial. Care is performed rather than felt. Empathy becomes an obligation instead of a natural movement of the heart. There is a growing sense of acting a role that no longer fits, yet abandoning it feels terrifying. If they stop responding emotionally, who are they? If they stop caring, what remains? Carl Jung described this phase as the ego confronting its own exhaustion. The psyche cannot sustain endless outward orientation without cost. When feeling is overextended, the unconscious demands compensation. What was once open begins to close. What was once fluid begins to harden. This is not dysfunction, it is self-regulation asserting itself. But the empath does not experience it that way. They interpret the shift as failure. They believe they are becoming cold, damaged, or spiritually regressed. Guilt enters the picture. Self-judgment intensifies. They try to care harder, listen longer, give more. The effort backfires. Emotional numbness increases. Fatigue deepens. The inner voice grows faint. This is where confusion dominates. The empath cannot understand why their greatest strength now feels like a liability. They still sense others clearly, yet that awareness no longer brings connection. Instead, it creates distance. Emotional information floods in, but the system has no capacity left to process it. The psyche begins to protect itself. This protection is subtle. It does not announce itself as boundaries. It appears as disengagement. The empath zones out during emotional conversations. They feel oddly detached during moments that once stirred deep feeling. They stop reacting automatically. At first, this feels wrong, almost dangerous, as if they are betraying their nature. Yet beneath the discomfort lies an important truth. The soul is pulling energy back. Jung understood that when identification with a role becomes total, the unconscious introduces disruption to force differentiation. The empath has become identified with sensitivity itself. They no longer possess empathy, it possesses them. This stage marks the beginning of separation. What makes this moment so destabilizing is that it looks like deterioration from the outside. Friends may notice distance, partners may accuse them of withdrawal, the empath themselves may fear they are losing their humanity. But internally, something else is happening. A deeper intelligence is reorganizing the psyche. The empath begins to realize, often unconsciously, that much of their caring was not freely chosen. It was reflexive, conditioned, driven by fear of conflict, abandonment, or disapproval. This realization is uncomfortable. It threatens the moral identity the empath has built over years. As awareness grows, resentment surfaces. Not dramatic resentment, but quiet, heavy disillusionment. The empath recognizes how often they gave without reciprocity, how frequently they held emotional space while their own inner world went unacknowledged, how rarely they were met with the same depth they offered. This recognition hurts. It destabilizes long-held beliefs about love, goodness, and spirituality. The empath may try to suppress it, but suppression only intensifies the inner fracture. The psyche insists on honesty. Sensitivity, once directed outward, now exposes internal imbalance. This is the danger of this stage, not because the empath becomes harmful, but because they stand at a crossroads. They can either retreat into numbness and bitterness, or they can move toward conscious differentiation. Jung would say this is where the shadow must be integrated, or it will dominate from below. If the empath refuses this integration, emotional shutdown follows. Caring collapses completely, isolation hardens, compassion turns brittle. But if the empath allows this discomfort to be seen clearly, something else emerges: discernment. This stage is not the end of empathy, it is the end of unconscious empathy. The soul is demanding a new relationship with feeling, one rooted in choice rather than compulsion. The old way of being sensitive is no longer viable. It has served its purpose. What comes next will feel unfamiliar, unsettling, and deeply transformative. This is the moment sensitivity stops being a virtue and starts becoming wisdom. And most people never make it past this point. What few people understand is that the empath's awakening does not culminate in deeper compassion. That belief belongs to a spiritual fantasy that confuses moral ideals with psychological reality. The final stage is far more unsettling. It is the moment empathy stops operating automatically and becomes selective, measured, and at times entirely absent. To the untrained eye, this looks like emotional death. In truth, it is the birth of inner authority. Carl Jung never framed individuation as becoming kinder, gentler, or more agreeable. He framed it as becoming whole. Wholeness includes limits. It includes withdrawal. It includes the capacity to say no without guilt and to remain unmoved without becoming cruel. For the empath, this means dismantling the unconscious belief that feeling deeply obligates them to respond endlessly. Up to this point, empathy functioned as a reflex. Emotional signals from others triggered immediate internal engagement. The empath absorbed tone, tension, sorrow, longing, and unspoken needs before conscious thought intervened. This reflex once served connection, but over time it became possession. The empath did not choose where their energy went. It was pulled outward by habit, conditioning, and identity. Jung would say the feeling function became autonomous. The psyche cannot tolerate this imbalance indefinitely. When one function dominates, the unconscious compensates by withdrawing libido, psychic energy, from that function. This withdrawal is experienced as emotional flatness, detachment, or a disturbing sense of not caring anymore. The ego interprets this as loss. The self knows it as correction. This is the crucial distinction. When the empath stops caring compulsively, it is not because love has disappeared. It is because love has been separated from fear. The empath is no longer driven by the need to maintain harmony, to be needed, to prevent emotional rupture at any cost. The nervous system, long overstimulated, begins to recalibrate. Silence returns, space appears. This is why this stage feels dangerous. The empath's previous sense of self collapses. They can no longer recognize themselves in their old reactions. Situations that once demanded immediate emotional involvement now register without urgency. Crises unfold without pulling them into panic. Emotional manipulation loses its grip. The empath notices, sometimes with shock, that they can witness suffering without dissolving into it. This feels unnatural at first. The old identity whispers accusations. You are cold, you are selfish, you are losing your humanity. But Jung warned that the psyche often frames growth as moral failure because growth threatens the persona. The persona survives on approval. Individuation does not require permission. Here lies the most misunderstood truth. Detachment is not indifference. Detachment is differentiation. The empath finally experiences the boundary between inner and outer reality. Other people's emotions are no longer treated as personal responsibility. The empath can recognize pain without internalizing it, understand suffering without carrying it, and offer presence without self-abandonment. This is the moment empathy transforms from a flood into a lens, and this is precisely why others react strongly to it. Those who benefited from the empath's emotional availability feel destabilized. Manipulators lose access. Dynamics built on imbalance begin to crumble. The empath is accused of changing, becoming distant, becoming unrecognizable. These accusations are accurate, but not in the way they are intended. The empath is no longer performing a role. They are standing in their center. Jung described this as the emergence of the self as organizing principle. Life is no longer governed by reaction, but by alignment. Choices arise from inner coherence rather than emotional pressure. Compassion becomes intentional, not compulsive. Care is offered where it resonates, withheld where it drains. This stage is dangerous because it removes the empath from familiar moral narratives. They can no longer rely on being the good one, the understanding one, or the emotional anchor. Those identities dissolve. In their place emerges something quieter and far more powerful: grounded presence. The empath no longer proves love through sacrifice. They no longer confuse pain with depth. They no longer equate endurance with virtue. They begin to understand that unlimited openness is not enlightenment, it is psychological exposure without containment. Here, the shadow integrates. The previously rejected aspects, self-interest, firmness, emotional neutrality, are no longer feared. They are recognized as necessary components of wholeness. Jung insisted that light without shadow is incomplete, and goodness without boundaries is unsustainable. The empath finally embodies this truth not as an idea but as lived reality. What emerges is not hardness, but solidity. The empath becomes difficult to manipulate because their emotions are no longer accessible through guilt or urgency. They become difficult to exhaust because their energy is no longer leaking through unconscious channels. They become difficult to predict because they are no longer governed by external emotional climates. This is why this stage feels lonely. Not because connection disappears, but because shallow connections fall away. Only relationships that respect boundaries, autonomy, and mutual presence survive this transformation. The empath has crossed a threshold. They no longer belong to the world of emotional reflex. They have entered the realm of conscious relation. Caring is no longer automatic, it is chosen. And in that choice, true power quietly takes root. This is not the end of empathy. It is the end of unconscious surrender. And Jung knew, only those who endure this stage without retreating ever touch the deepest form of freedom. This stage rarely feels powerful while you are inside it. It feels quiet, disorienting, and strangely empty. The empath does not wake up one day feeling enlightened. They wake up feeling different, and that difference is unsettling. Familiar emotional responses no longer arrive on command. Situations that once pulled them in now pass without the same internal reaction. There is no celebration in this moment, only uncertainty. The empath begins to notice small changes first. Conversations end sooner. Messages remain unanswered longer. Emotional demands from others register, but they no longer trigger immediate action. This is not intentional withdrawal. It happens naturally, almost against the empath's will. And because it is not chosen consciously at first, it brings guilt. A quiet voice inside asks, "What is wrong with me?" Another whispers, "I used to care more." The empath remembers who they were, the one who stayed late listening, the one who sensed shifts before they were spoken, the one people relied on during emotional storms. That version felt meaningful, needed, alive. Losing that role feels like losing purpose itself. What few talk about is the grief that accompanies this transition. The empath mourns the version of themselves that believed love meant constant availability. They grieve the identity that gave them value through emotional endurance. They miss the feeling of being indispensable, even if it came at great personal cost. This grief is complicated because it is not clear what has been lost, or whether it should be reclaimed. Loneliness sets in during this phase, but it is not the loneliness of isolation. It is the loneliness of standing somewhere unfamiliar. Old emotional patterns no longer fit, yet new ones have not fully formed. The empath exists in between identities, between ways of relating, between worlds. People around them notice. Some respond with concern, others with frustration. "You've changed," they say. "You're distant. You're not like you used to be." These words land heavily because they are true, and yet, returning to the old way feels impossible. The empath realizes that many connections were sustained by their emotional labor alone. When that labor diminishes, the bond weakens. This realization is painful, but also clarifying. It reveals which relationships were mutual and which depended on imbalance. This is where the empath begins to feel truly seen by themselves for the first time. They start noticing how often they ignored their own exhaustion, how frequently they stayed present while silently wishing to leave, how often they sensed discomfort in their body but dismissed it in the name of kindness. These memories surface gently, without accusation. just recognition. Jung believed that consciousness expands through honest self-observation, not judgment, not justification, just seeing clearly. And what becomes clear is this: the empath was not choosing to give, they were compelled to. And compulsion, no matter how noble it appears, is not freedom. This realization changes how the empath experiences the world. Emotional intensity no longer feels impressive. Drama no longer feels meaningful. They crave simplicity, clarity, and quiet presence. Noise becomes draining. Depth becomes selective. At times, the empath wonders if they are becoming empty. But slowly, something else emerges in the silence, a sense of groundedness, a feeling of being inside oneself rather than stretched outward, a calm that does not depend on external validation. This is where self-trust begins to form, not loudly, not confidently, but steadily. The empath starts listening inward, not to thoughts, but to subtle signals: tension, ease, resistance, openness. Decisions begin to align with these signals, not because they are spiritual, but because they are honest. And in this honesty, a new intimacy with life develops. The empath no longer needs to be needed to feel real. They no longer define love through sacrifice. They begin to understand that presence does not require self-erasure. That connection does not demand exhaustion. That caring, when chosen freely, feels entirely different from caring driven by fear. This stage is tender. It requires patience. It asks the empath to tolerate misunderstanding without rushing to explain. It invites them to stand quietly in their truth without proving it to anyone. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the loneliness changes shape. It becomes spaciousness, not absence but room to breathe. This is where the empath begins to meet themselves, not as a role, not as a function, but as a whole human being. This stage does not ask you to fix yourself. It does not demand confrontation, renunciation, or dramatic transformation. It asks for something quieter, and because it is quiet, it is often overlooked. It asks for attention, not attention directed outward toward other people's needs or emotional climates, but attention turned inward toward the subtle signals you have learned to ignore. Sensation, tension, relief, fatigue. The body has been speaking for a long time. Now it must be heard. Awakening here is not an act of will. It is an allowance. Allow yourself to notice where your energy moves without consent. Notice which interactions leave you smaller, more fragmented, less present. Notice how quickly your system tries to manage emotions that are not yours to manage. This observation does not require correction. Seeing is enough to begin the shift. Jung believed that consciousness expands not through effort, but through integration. Integration happens when what was unconscious is allowed into awareness without resistance. For the empath, this means allowing discomfort to exist without rushing to neutralize it, letting silence remain without filling it, letting distance form without interpreting it as rejection. This is difficult because old patterns are persuasive. The impulse to explain, to soothe, to re-enter emotional labor arises automatically. But awakening does not mean suppressing that impulse. It means not obeying it blindly. There is a subtle practice here. When the urge to care appears, do not act immediately. Stay with the sensation. Feel where it lives in the body. Is it tight? Is it urgent? Is it anxious? Often beneath the impulse to help lies fear. Fear of being misunderstood, abandoned, or perceived as unkind. Recognizing this fear does not make you less loving. It makes your love cleaner. This is where choice is born. Caring that arises from clarity feels different. It does not drain. It does not require performance. It does not expect recognition. It moves slowly and stops naturally. You will recognize it by the absence of inner conflict. The call here is not to withdraw from life, but to participate selectively. To let resonance guide connection rather than obligation. To allow some doors to remain closed without guilt. To accept that not all suffering requires your presence. This is not spiritual detachment as escape. It is detachment as respect for the limits of your psyche. Jung warned that when limits are ignored, the unconscious enforces them through symptoms. Fatigue, anxiety, emotional numbness, these are not failures, they are messages. Awakening means responding to those messages rather than overriding them. You are not being asked to become harder, you are being asked to become truer. Truer to what feels sustainable, truer to what feels aligned, truer to the quiet knowing that arises when you stop managing the emotional field around you. This phase invites patience. The nervous system needs time to relearn safety without hyperattunement. Old reflexes soften gradually, new rhythms emerge slowly. Trust this pace. Rushing here recreates the very patterns you are leaving behind. Awakening at this level is subtle reorientation. Energy returns to its source. Attention gathers inward. Presence becomes grounded rather than diffuse. Nothing about this needs to be announced. It will be felt, and those who can feel it will understand. At some point, often without realizing when it happened, the empath notices a fundamental shift. Life feels calmer, not because circumstances improved, but because inner reactions no longer spiral outward. Situations that once demanded emotional urgency now register with neutrality. Not apathy, clarity. The world continues as it always has, yet the empath stands differently within it. This is the moment when something essential becomes clear. The empath did not lose their sensitivity. They refined it. They did not become distant from life. They stepped into it without dissolving. They did not harden. They stabilized. What once leaked outward in constant response now gathers inward as presence. People sense this change even if they cannot name it. Conversations feel different. Emotional hooks fail to land. Manipulation dissolves before it takes shape. The empath no longer explains themselves into exhaustion. They no longer defend boundaries with arguments. Their stillness speaks for them. Jung would recognize this state immediately. It is the quiet authority of a psyche no longer governed by unconscious compulsion. The self has taken its place at the center. Reactions are no longer automatic. Care is no longer currency. Attention is no longer scattered across emotional emergencies. This is why the empath becomes untouchable, not because nothing affects them, but because nothing owns them. They can be present with suffering without being consumed by it. They can love without abandoning themselves. They can walk away without resentment. They can remain without losing form. Their inner world is no longer shaped by the moods, needs, or expectations of others. What remains is not emptiness, but space. Space to feel what is real. Space to choose what matters. Space to exist without performance. The empath understands now that true compassion does not rush. True presence does not drain. True connection does not require sacrifice of the self. These truths are no longer beliefs. They are lived realities. And so the cycle completes. The empath who once gave themselves away in the name of love now stands whole, not elevated above others, not withdrawn from the world, simply grounded in their own being. Nothing dramatic announces this arrival. No title is claimed. No identity is displayed. There is only a quiet knowing. The most dangerous moment was never when the empath cared too much. It was the moment they stopped caring unconsciously. Because from that moment on, nothing could control them again.